Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Sector, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today I'm joined by Job. Job, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do?
Thanks, Gleb. Yeah, I'm Job. I'm the founder and CEO of Remote.com, which is a company that makes it possible to hire, pay, and manage people anywhere in the planet.
Excellent. Now, you started Remote already in 2019, Job. Why did you start it way back then?
So before Remote, I was working at a company called GitLab, and GitLab was, since its founding, a fully distributed remote organization. So if we would look for somebody, we would find just the best person we could find wherever they were in the planet and hire that person there. Never had any offices, and it worked really, really well. But what didn't work well is we would find somebody in a country where we never hired somebody before, and now we had to figure out, how do we pay them? How do we make sure they get benefits, for example? And what we found was that there were a million solutions, and all of them were really expensive, really slow, and it tended to be really poor experience for the individual. So, for example, if you wanted to expense something, you might have to fax something over to a particular place. So it was incredibly painful. But that model of hiring people everywhere worked incredibly well. It worked really well for us as a business because it was very easy to find people. And it worked great for individuals because they didn't have to move for a good job that was well paying and interesting and challenging. And so it was very obvious that this was the future of how businesses were going to be built. Right? Because the constraints on businesses will remain forever the same, which is you want to hire great people, and there's always more people away from your office than near your office. So somebody had to solve this particular problem. So Marcelo, my co-founder, and I, we decided we were going to solve it, and that's how we started Remote.
Well, you got it really well timed.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, you definitely benefited from that, got the silver lining benefit. Now, one of the challenges that a number of companies we're seeing right now is that they're going back to the office. They're saying that they're not going to hire remote workers, or they're having challenges with the remote workers. What do you figure is going on here? Why are people making these decisions and not going to that future of what you're describing as hiring remote workers around the world, whatever the talent?
Yeah, I think the fundamentals have not changed, right? So I think the demand for talent remains as high as ever, if it's only increasing. I think what has changed is that individuals now know that they can do their work remotely, right? And so as an individual, if I'm being sent back to the office, I might think to myself, well, there might be other employers, and there certainly are, that are willing to hire me. And so why are employers sending people back to the office? Well, I think because remote work isn't working for them. And it's probably not working for them because they didn't take the time to really work remotely. Rather, they try to maybe replicate an office-based way of working in a remote setting, which of course doesn't work very well. It means you probably end up doing the same inefficient things that you did in the office inefficiently remotely, which makes them more painful, right? For example, sitting in a meeting room is already very painful in an office, but at least you can joke with each other and all have a coffee together and maybe eat some stuff while you're at it. In a remote setting, it's worse, right? Nobody wants to sit for hours upon hours in virtual meetings. And so I think that is probably one of the reasons. Another thing that I've been seeing is that even companies that talk about returning to the office, they don't do it the entire week. They realize that there are significant benefits for almost everybody involved. And so I think we're ending up in a scenario where companies are uncomfortable. They are not sure what to do. The economy is somewhat repressed. So, employers feel like I need to act and I need to do something, and maybe this will help me in some other way. And I think there's a layer of management that is very uncomfortable with managing in any other way than just observing people. And they feel uncomfortable. What is my role if I'm not just looking at people and talking to them? Whereas, of course, my opinion is you should manage people by output, not by presence. But nonetheless, I think that certainly plays a role as well.
Yeah, and I like to read some Quartz article on this topic. So I helped over 2 dozen companies figure out their future work strategies. And it's definitely the case that when I start working with them, I do see that they're using office-based strategies to manage hybrid workers and remote. And that's a big challenge. So what should companies be doing? What are some of the best practices in actually managing remote workers effectively?
So, I mean, I think the answer is in the question, right? You have to manage effectiveness and output rather than presence. I think that's a really important start. And so it starts by having a deep understanding of what are you actually doing as a manager and how do you make sure people are successful. And it definitely isn't observing whether they work. It is creating clear expectations. And then when people meet or don't meet those expectations, coaching them to either get up to those expectations or surpass them and create next steps in their careers for them, right? I think that is a really clear step one. The other one is, a series of things you can do that are not difficult to do, but it's important that you point them out. One of them, for example, making sure that you communicate effectively. What you don't want to do in a remote environment is constantly be asking for each other's attention by video call or even by chat. And so you want to default as much as you can to working asynchronously. So writing down information in a particular place where everybody can find it, and then making sure that rather than asking a colleague for a particular kind of information, just look it up yourself, right? And this is a really straightforward thing to do, but it's really fundamental, and it makes working remotely much more pleasant for everybody involved. And even as a manager, having a good standard, for example, having an agenda with your report. If you have a one-on-one meeting, before the meeting is going to both your manager and the report help establish, well, what is this going to be about? And then, for example, another, there's tens of these kind of techniques, but I think these are really valuable. If you have a meeting with a report, you're a manager, somebody reports up to you, and you have a one-on-one. The contents of that meeting should not be about what is the work that you're doing, what is the work that you've delivered, because that's information that's available asynchronously and outside of that meeting as well. Rather, the meeting should be, how can we help you get better? How can I coach you to get better? What do you want to talk about? Or maybe take the time to connect with each other, because in a remote environment, one of the things that is much more difficult is to form connections between people, right? Emotional connections. And so spending time, deliberate time on that, I think is a really important part of this as well.
It is really important. One of the big things I work with companies on who do hire remote workers with my clients is building up culture in the remote setting. And there are a variety of ways to do that, like virtual coffee meetings, both deliberate planned ones, and then matching where you match randomly with people across the company, so you get connections. There's virtual co-working, so for example, where a team dials into a video conference call and they work on their individual tasks, but they have an opportunity to ask each other questions during that period, especially helpful for junior staff, the kind of team bonding. I'm curious what techniques you've seen for forming connections that you find to be effective in that remote setting.
Yeah, I have a strange opinion about this, which is that I think there's no any strategy in particular that is magical. I think what is important is that you establish shared values. So we have company values at Remote. They are shared, and we're very clear about what they are, why they are. We give examples and we give counter examples. And besides that, we have clear communication policy. So we sort of outline Remote is a space where this is how we communicate with each other. This is how we treat each other. This is what we find important. And these are the kind of behaviors that we don't like. And within that space, the scaffolding, as it were, we create sort of a safe space. And then the second step is we make it very easy to connect with each other. So we have a lot of different tools, but they're all very straightforward. Google Meet, Slack, these kind of tools. And then a few others, like randomly matching people for coffee chats. But all those things are opt-in. And so what we do is we create opportunities for individuals to connect with each other, all opt-in. But because it's a safe space, and because many people, and I would say most people, have a tendency to seek out others and to seek that connection, given that the threshold to connect is low, given that the environment is safe, you don't have to do a lot extra, right? For example, we don't do a lot of meetups that are planned and designed and otherwise paid for by Remote, and yet people still meet up quite regularly within the team. Why do people do that? Because they want to, right? And so my philosophy is like, if we create this like really strong scaffolding, which creates a safe culture and safe organization, then people will self-serve and they will help themselves and create these mini cultures within the organization and create their own connection. I think that is actually the most important thing. That said, I do like the random coffee meetings. I think that's very fun. And one of my favorite things is that we have these welcome calls that I do with my co-founder, where all the people that have recently joined just ask us random questions. And I think those kind of things are always really fun to do. But the most important thing is the other part. The tools and techniques, I think, matter not as much.
Interesting. So something I haven't heard you talk about, maybe you already do that, is training. I found that in terms of managers being able to manage in remote settings, a lot of managers would like to know how to do that, but they just don't really have the skill set. They don't have the ability. They know how to manage by walking around and how to observe people, but they don't really know how to manage people, whether hybrid, so who come to the office sometimes, or fully remote. So I'm curious what you're finding about specifically training managers to manage teams in remote settings.
Yeah, I mean, with us, we have a training program, right? And continuous training for anybody who is a people manager. And I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial in two different ways. One is to essentially establish the basics, like you were explaining. I think the basics are not complicated, right? It's a small set of guidelines. How do you focus on the output and the person instead of, the presence? But I think the other part, which is, continuous training, is something that might be unique to your organization, because you also want to instill the company's values, the way that you would like to go about doing things. And so I think what really helps and what helped us is to create a manager community, right? Where you create a community where you can talk between different managers, you can share experiences, and learn from each other, besides learning from the content that we continuously supply and try to amend and add to. But I don't think it is that difficult. I think there's many companies are completely unaware of the fact that you need to be a different kind of manager. And so they're also not setting up things to teach people to be great remote managers, right? And so they don't know. So who's going to tell them? But if you're a company set up like mine, or if you happen to speak with us, you get in the right direction pretty quickly.
The other thing that I want to mention that I see is a challenge for companies that are mostly remote is onboarding new staff and then mentoring them. So that's definitely a challenge, where onboarding staff, mentoring them, getting them into your culture. Staff are typically used to doing that in person. Managers are used to doing that in person. Colleagues are used to doing that in person. And so you need to have an effective onboarding program and then a mentoring program that continuously mentors folks. I'm curious what you're finding about both onboarding and mentoring in remote settings.
Yeah, I hear this often, that this is difficult for companies. I've never really understood it, because, like, for me, I think to myself, well, what makes it easier in person? It's you can do the exact same things, right? Like I genuinely wonder about that. And so, I mean, there's a few things that we do, and I think that answers most of the question. I think first is there's a body of documentation and courses that we serve people when they start at the company. So they explain the basics everybody needs to know, right? One of them is, what are the company values, and how do we operate? How do we talk to each other, right? How do we performance manage these kind of things? Then there's a part where you need to start forming those initial connections. And so what we do is we make sure that people actually call with a number of people outside of their direct team and direct organization where they will be working with, so they start to form connections. And then they get an onboarding buddy, which is somebody in a different department who will be there to answer any dumb questions they might have, right? Dumb questions. There's no dumb questions, but so they feel like the threshold is really low to ask questions. And then lastly, for mentoring and ongoing mentoring, that's where your manager comes in, right? And their job specifically is to help you grow and help you succeed. And so we really encourage managers to have at least one-on-one meeting with each of their reports per week. And exceptions are, very experienced people that are very comfortable, they might do it fewer than that. But in general, that is what a manager is supposed to do. They are supposed to help manage something. Now, having said that, I think roles where you really need to teach somebody, where you need to spend hours upon hours daily one-on-one, I think those are kind of things that might be more difficult in just an arbitrary remote environment. And you would have to be very deliberate, for example, about making sure people have enough of an overlap in hours in time zones. But all the other things kind of work independent of time zones and like how distributed you are.
I think in terms of other companies, some of the things that you described just happen naturally without the company structuring it in person. And you need to structure it more deliberately when you're working remotely. Yes, absolutely.
For sure. Yeah.
But it needs to be more deliberate. Now, as we finish up, what is your vision of what's going to happen with remote work going forward? we're having these transformations, both economic transformations, companies bringing back to the office, the rise of generative AI. I personally think it's going to facilitate remote work. It's going to make it easier to get information. But I'm curious what you are thinking about and the impact of development on remote work.
I mean, in general, I don't think the fundamentals are changing anytime soon, right? Again, I think the fundamentals, the driving forces are a need for talent, and now a much stronger sense from individuals of if I'm a knowledge worker, I don't need to be in the office, right? That is not to my benefit, nor to the benefit of my work. That's to the benefit of my boss, right? Who's probably a poor manager. And I think those fundamental forces, they are not changing, right? And I think those will very much keep driving companies to hire more internationally, hire more remotely over time, as well as individuals seek out more work that does that kind of thing. As far as, like, for example, AI and large language models, I think that is just another technology that will benefit us all. And I agree with you. I think it helps, for example, working asynchronously a lot because it makes it easier to find the information, right? Which is one of the challenges in large remote organizations is finding information, not so much writing it down, but finding it is very hard, distilling it, summarizing it. I think those are things that, yeah, we couldn't do in the past automatically, and now we can do them pretty well. And so I just expect that to continue. I also think that there's a role for technology in making it easier to connect with each other, right? I think the one thing that is really hard to replicate is a sense of presence, which is a very intangible thing, except it's really obvious when you have it, right? Like, it's very hard to get a sense of presence when, you are now on my flat screen in my office and I can hear you and I can see you and I can see you move, but the sense of presence is still really low. But the moment that we were to both set up and put on a VR headset together right now, our sense of presence would be greater, even though we might be looking at cartoonish avatars. And in the very near future, we'll be able to see somewhat photorealistic avatars. And in the further future, that VR headset becomes small to maybe almost entirely disappearing. Now, I think those kind of things will make working remotely even more accessible because that the thing that you miss, you won't have to miss anymore, right? And so, in the great scheme, if you really zoom out in history, I think we live in this like tiny little window where we feel very distant looking at each other at a flat screen. But we'll just be going from an in-person office to a virtual office pretty soon, I would say, if you zoom out far enough. And like large language models and AI will just make the nature of work we do slightly different. But I don't think it will shift the fact that we'll be working. I think that will take much longer.
Excellent. That's a great vision, Jaap. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your vision.
Thanks so much for that.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show, and it helps us improve the show.